Okay, so thank you all for the literature reviews that you submitted last night. I'm looking forward to reading them. And we're going to move on to our final project of the quarter, which luckily will be very similar to your literature review. You will keep the same text, you will keep most of the same sources, but you'll add another component. So what we're going to do now is talk about using literary criticism. So as you know, the last project we really focused on using cultural studies, right? So we were making connections between texts and society using a cultural studies lens. Okay, so as you know, what you were doing with literary criticism is you're sort of breaking from your way of thinking, right? So you had to connect the text with society in some way. So what is literary criticism? Right, we've read several ideas about what it is. It adds logical thinking for explaining an idea, or explanation and reasoning for a primary feature of a text. So here's a quote from Ken Lahey in Key Themes in Media Theory. He says, "Theory is really nothing more than a way of thinking that is more systematic and sophisticated than quote-unquote thinking in an everyday sense." Okay, so really what we're talking about here, literary criticism is not absolute, right? It is not the only way to read a text. There are multiple ways of interpretation, and these are different strategies that work well with different texts. Okay, so you actually have been doing this quite a bit, right? We've talked about formalism, the close reading, right, where we really zone in on the specific details. We don't look outside the text at all. In a way, the text exists as itself, right? So the parts of the text help you interpret it. We've also done reader response criticism, where you say what you think and feel in response to texts. Right? We've done that in our discussion boards, my favorite verse presentations. And then cultural studies, where we read about the different types of cultural studies, New Historicism, Queer Theory, Postcolonial Studies, American Multiculturalism, right? So that was your lit review. Okay. So what's left? We only have three optional styles, optional types of literary criticism. They are feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, and psychoanalytic criticism. So feminist criticism, interpreting texts to see how women are portrayed in them. Marxist criticism is really connected to economics and society. And then psychoanalytic criticism is really closely connected to the psychology. Okay, so formalism we've discussed. You can go back to read more about formalism in this PowerPoint. Right, so formalism was in our close reading, where we're really connecting to the important aspects of that text. Then we had our cultural studies, right? So we talked a lot about this quarter, cultural studies. So it really talks about the relationship between a text and an identity or a society, right? So we've really been focusing on that. And within those fields, right, we have the key term of hegemony versus marginalization, right, where certain groups hold power, other groups are marginalized in that they receive less power, less control, and then sort of how those power dynamics create certain texts, create conditions in which texts are related, and things like that. Okay, then we talked about multiculturalism. We read these ideas in our cultural studies, our book, in our textbook. Then we had New Historicism. This is where most of you landed, right? I think almost every lit review is New Historicism. The text was influenced by culture, bias, interpretation. So, for example, we have this 19th century advertisement, which we could completely study in cultural studies. It is Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, right? So a big draw at this time was snake oil, something we don't use anymore. And I think this might be a joke. Can't tell. But this is an idea of how times change, right? So different times create different texts. Okay. Then we went on and we read about queer theory, right? So a way of interpreting normativity or non-normativity. So usually to some related to gender and sexuality. So queer theory is often focusing on strangeness relating to gender and sexuality. Okay, so we've learned about all of these in our textbook. We talked about post-colonial studies, right? So the relationship again between power and control. So who is in control of a place? What happens to a place after an outside ruling force leaves it? Okay, so we really talked about that. Antigua is an example of a formerly colonized island. This is the Queen of England when she was young. So it is now controlled autonomously, so no longer is it under British rule. So we could ask the question like, how did Antigua's colonial history influence the social forces at play in Jamaica Kincaid's Girl? So a short story written by an Antiguan author named Jamaica Kincaid. So we could talk about her upbringing in Antigua and how it influenced her writing of this particular story. Okay, so all of those are familiar. We're going to talk about the last three, right? So we are going to read and learn about these last three types of criticism that are covered in our textbook. So there are so many different types of criticism. If you don't like some of these, there are many more. There are many more options. Formalism is probably, kind of the critique for the person who doesn't like other kinds of lenses, right? We just think about the text existing on its own. If you like to think about the text in terms of, do I like it or not? That's reader response. But if you kind of like to think about the text in terms of its relationship to, what it is saying about its society, then you can use a lot of these cultural studies methods, or we can go to feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, or psychoanalytic criticism. So let's start with feminist criticism. And as you might guess, this type of criticism focuses on how women or female characters have been portrayed in texts. It can also consider how patriarchal values have influenced women writers, right? So those are two kinds of ways that this is usually used. So if we talk about what our textbook says, what Kurtzner and Mandel say on page 1666, they say feminist critics claim that paternalist cultural stereotypes pervade works of literature in the canon. Right, so the canon being the great works of literature, ancient books to more modern novels, right? So these kind of cultural stereotypes influence the creation of female characters in these novels, according to feminist critics. So, for example, we could definitely have a feminist reading of our novel that we read this quarter, Kindred. So how does Octavia Butler's femininity, or lack of femininity, so the author's personal conception of her femaleness, how does that influence her construction of her alter ego Dana in Kindred? So this was something that a lot of you were picking up on in our discussion boards, right? That she had this interesting relationship with femininity. So this could be something that you could explore in an essay. Okay, so we go on to Marxist criticism. So this type of criticism is named after the theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So they were economists and theorists. They talked about the relationship of power between the ruling class and the working class. So how much influence could the working class have? How did the status in society influence the creation of life and of texts? Okay, so essentially we would examine a text through an economic or social lens. Okay, so if we look at the quote from our text here, Marxist critics apply these views about class struggle to their readings of poetry, fiction, and drama. So a lot of this is about class, right? So what class is the writer from? What class is the writer depicting? The writer or the creator, I suppose. So this type of criticism can be applied to any kind of text. Okay, so works are studied to examine class conflicts and class privilege. Okay, so we could talk about our favorite play, Samuel Beckett's Endgame, using this kind of critical lens. How does the post-World War II world marketplace influence the bleak outlook in Samuel Beckett's Endgame? Right, so we can connect the bleakness of this play with the world marketplace, so sort of the economic lens put onto Samuel Beckett's Endgame. And last, we have everybody's favorite, psychoanalytic criticism. So if you are not familiar with this term, psychoanalytic, it comes from the famous Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. So he is, the father of psychology, and he would, treat various mental ailments using psychoanalysis. So that is what we would do if we were to use a psychoanalytic lens. This is our friend Emily Dickinson up in the corner. We read her work. So, for example, we could say, how does a psychological point of view of Emily Dickinson's psyche, so how she thinks, other things that depict her mental state, like her letters, her diaries, how does that help us interpret metaphors in her poetry, right? So, again, that could be a valid interpretation of her poetry. It may not be, right? You could say it is totally unfair to read Emily Dickinson's metaphors as a commentary on her psychology, right? So again, these are optional, right? It is not right or wrong to use a critical lens, but you do have to suggest why a certain lens might be valid. Okay, so this type of criticism for psychoanalytic, this focuses on how texts display the inner workings of the human mind. Okay, so again, no matter what type of criticism you are using, so if you like cultural studies, if you want to use Marxist criticism or psychoanalytic criticism, or, new historicism, you have to decide, does this type of reading really fit my text? Does it fit what I am finding out, right? So you have to make a case for your use of a particular critical lens, which is exactly what you will do in this final essay. Okay, so please, after you use this PowerPoint, also use the textbook definitions. And one of the things that you will be doing in week 9 is you will be finding a critical lens source description. Okay, so you will need to find a scholarly source just describing your chosen critical lens. Okay, so keep that in mind. Whichever one of these types of critical lenses is standing out to you as an interpretation of your chosen text, really use that information, right? I really think that I could interpret my poetry, my Emily Dickinson poetry, using a psychoanalytic criticism. So that is totally valid. Okay, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you soon.